They told J.D. Vance to leave. They expected him to get angry, expected him to make a scene. But what he did next left the whole diner in stunned silence. J.D. Vance stepped out of his car and into the cool evening air. The neon sign of Lou's Grill flickered above him, buzzing softly in the quiet of the small-town street. It was late, he was exhausted, and all he wanted was a burger and a moment to clear his head. But the second he walked through the door, he felt it. Not outright hostility. Not yet, but something close. The low murmur of conversation didn't stop completely, but it changed, shifted, like a radio dial turning just slightly off station. A waitress near the counter paused mid-step, her smile faltering for just a second before she looked away. A man at the bar, halfway through his beer, glanced over, then leaned in to whisper to the guy beside him. J.D. had been in enough rooms to know when he wasn't welcome. Still, he kept his posture relaxed, forcing a small nod at the waitress as he approached. "Table for one," he said, his voice even. She hesitated. Then, with a tight smile, she said, "1 second, sir." And just like that, she was gone, disappearing through the swinging kitchen doors before he could say another word. J.D. exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders back. He could feel it now, the weight of every pair of eyes on him. A woman in a denim jacket sitting near the window shifted in her seat. A young guy, maybe in his 20s, grinned slightly like he was enjoying the tension. The old man at the end of the bar, hands weathered, work jacket faded, didn't look up from his plate, but he wasn't eating either. J.D. didn't move, didn't react, didn't give them anything, because he knew, whatever was happening here, it was bigger than just him. Then, the kitchen doors swung open, and the waitress stepped back out. This time she wasn't uncertain. She was decided. "I'm sorry, sir," she said. Her voice was firm now. "But we can't serve you tonight." The room went still. For a long moment, J.D. didn't say anything. The words sat there between them, thick and unmoving. He had been expecting something was off the second he stepped inside, but hearing it out loud was different. It was final. The kind of rejection that didn't come with an explanation because it didn't need one. The restaurant wasn't silent, not completely. The kitchen grill still sizzled, and somewhere in the back, the clatter of plates being stacked echoed through the space, but the usual hum of conversation was gone. People were watching now, not trying to hide it anymore. The old man at the counter chewed slower, his fork hovering just above his plate. The guy near the window, the one who had been grinning before, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest, like he was waiting to see what would happen next. J.D. let out a slow breath through his nose, his hands settling on his hips. He wasn't going to argue, at least not yet. He had spent enough time in places where his presence wasn't welcomed to know that making a scene wouldn't change anyone's mind. But this wasn't just about him. He could feel that now. Feel the weight of something bigger pressing into the space between him and the waitress standing in front of him. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice even. "Did I do something wrong?" The waitress didn't fidget this time, didn't glance toward the kitchen like she needed permission. Her shoulders squared, her lips pressing into a thin line. "It's just, we'd rather not serve you tonight." No policy, no excuse about being short-staffed, no pretense of anything other than what it was. J.D. studied her face, but there was nothing cruel in it, no satisfaction in turning him away. Just a decision, one that had already been made long before he walked in. He glanced past her toward the kitchen window where 2 cooks stood just beyond the counter, half hidden behind the heat lamps stacked with orders. Their faces were unreadable, but he could tell they were listening. Someone muttered something from a nearby booth, low enough that J.D. couldn't make out the words, but the meaning was clear. A rejection like this wasn't just about what was being said, it was about who was watching, who was approving, who was silently pushing it forward. He could leave, shake his head, turn around, and walk out the door without another word. He could act like this didn't bother him, like he hadn't just felt something shift in the air, something deeper than just a restaurant turning a customer away, or he could make a point, force an answer, refuse to let this moment pass by without at least trying to understand why. He nodded slowly, keeping his voice measured. "Can I speak with the manager?" That caught a few people off guard. The waitress hesitated, and for the first time a flicker of something uncertain passed across her face. She glanced toward the kitchen, and J.D. could see the moment she weighed her options. the way her fingers curled slightly against the notepad in her hand like she was gripping something solid to steady herself. A cough broke the moment. J.D. turned slightly, catching the gaze of the old man at the counter. He looked like he had been coming here for years, the kind of regular who didn't need a menu because he always ordered the same thing. His blue work jacket was frayed at the cuffs, his hands rough from years of labor. He shook his head, more to himself than anyone else, before stabbing his fork into the last of his eggs. Across the room, the younger guy in the booth let out a short laugh, shaking his head like he couldn't believe J.D. was actually doing this. "Man, just take the hint," he muttered. "Nobody wants you here." J.D. didn't look at him. He stayed focused on the waitress, waiting. She swallowed once, then nodded. One moment, she disappeared through a door at the back of the restaurant. This time, the silence that followed was heavier. It stretched across the room, pressing in from all sides, a kind of waiting that wasn't just about curiosity, it was about expectation, about seeing what he would do next. The old man at the counter went back to eating, but slower now. A woman in the corner booth shifted, pulling her coffee cup closer, her fingers drumming lightly against the ceramic. J.D. rolled his shoulders back, exhaling slowly. He could feel it now, the weight of something bigger than just a refusal. A few more beats of silence. The door swung open, and a broad-shouldered man stepped out. His apron was stained from a long shift, the sleeves of his shirt pushed up past his elbows. He had the look of someone who had spent years running a place like this, tired but firm, a man who had made too many decisions to second-guess one now. His name tag read Rick. Rick didn't ask J.D. what he wanted. He didn't offer a handshake, didn't introduce himself. He just looked him over once, slow and deliberate, then crossed his arms over his chest. "I hear you got a question," he said. The way he said it wasn't welcoming, wasn't polite, it was a challenge. J.D. met his stare, steady and unreadable. He wasn't here to fight, wasn't here to throw his weight around, but he also wasn't about to just walk out without an answer. "Yeah," J.D. said, keeping his voice even. "I'd like to know why you won't serve me." Rick exhaled sharply through his nose, like he had been expecting the question but still wasn't in the mood to answer. He wiped his hands on his apron, glanced toward the handful of customers still watching the exchange. Some were pretending not to listen. Others didn't bother hiding their curiosity. Rick shifted his weight, rolling his jaw once before speaking. "Look," he said, "this ain't personal." J.D. raised an eyebrow. "Seems personal." Rick's jaw tightened just slightly, but he didn't argue. He rubbed the back of his neck, then finally sighed. "People around here got their opinions about you," he said. "About the things you stand for." J.D. nodded slowly, letting the words settle. "And me sitting down for a meal is trouble?" Rick didn't answer right away. He glanced toward the counter where the old man in the work jacket had gone back to his eggs, chewing slower now. Across the room, the younger guy in the booth still had his arms crossed, watching. His grin was gone now, replaced with something else, something closer to curiosity. J.D. had seen this before. Not exactly like this, but close enough. This wasn't just about one man's decision. This was about the pressure of the room, the silent expectations, the ripple effect of what would happen next. J.D. studied Rick's face, watching the way his fingers curled slightly against his apron, the way his shoulders tensed just a little. And for the first time, J.D. saw it, a flicker of doubt. Not much, but enough. He nodded once, then asked, "Be honest with me. Do you agree with this, or is this just about keeping the peace?" Rick hesitated, just for a second. But that second was all J.D. needed. Before Rick could answer, the younger guy in the booth let out a sharp laugh. "Oh, come on," he said, shaking his head. "This ain't that deep. You're just not welcome here. Simple as that." J.D. turned toward him, studying him for a moment. He looked like the kind of guy who enjoyed a good fight, someone who had been waiting for an excuse to say something. J.D. didn't bite. He just looked back at Rick. "I've got no problem leaving," J.D. said. "If that's really what you want." The words hung there. A chance. A chance for Rick to take a breath, to reconsider, to push back against whatever pressure had led to this moment. Rick's gaze flicked toward the kitchen, then back to J.D. "I just don't want things to get ugly," he said finally. J.D. nodded. "Neither do I." A few more seconds passed. Neither of them spoke. JD could have left, could have shaken his head, walked out, and never looked back. Could have made a call, turned this into a headline. But instead, he did something no one expected. He pulled out a chair, sat down, and said, "Then let's talk." The room tensed. JD didn't slam the chair down, didn't puff up his chest, didn't raise his voice. He simply sat, resting his hands on the table like he had all the time in the world. The restaurant wasn't used to this. Confrontations usually ended quickly, one side storming out or one side shutting down. But this wasn't that. Rick let out a slow exhale. "Talk," he repeated like the word itself didn't belong here. JD shrugged. "You don't want me here. I get that. What I don't get is why. So let's talk about it." A low chuckle came from the younger guy in the booth. "Man, this guy's got nerve." JD ignored him. Rick pulled out the chair across from JD but didn't sit down. He leaned on it, arms resting against the back, his apron still dusted with flour from the morning shift. "I run a business," Rick said finally. "I don't pick fights. I don't want headlines, but I got a community to think about." JD nodded. "All right, so tell me, what does this community think about me?" Rick looked over his shoulder, almost like he was waiting for someone else to answer that question. The waitress behind the counter shifted uncomfortably. The old man at the bar kept his eyes down, but his fork hadn't moved in a while. Then Rick looked back. "People here don't like politicians, don't trust them, and some of the things you've said, some of the things you've stood for, it doesn't sit right with folks." JD leaned back slightly. "Fair enough, but you don't know me, do you?" Rick hesitated. "Not personally, no." "Then tell me," JD continued, his voice even. "If I was just some guy walking in here, not someone you've seen on TV, would we even be having this conversation?" Silence. JD let the quiet stretch, watching Rick's expression shift just slightly. Not a full change, but something cracked, even if it was small. Then, from the back of the room, the younger guy scoffed. "This isn't about TV, man. It's about people knowing who you really are." JD turned toward him. "And who am I?" The guy grinned, finally getting the attention he had been craving. "You're the guy who acts like he understands regular people, but you play politics like everyone else." JD nodded slowly, considering that. "All right," he said. "Then tell me, what do you think I should have done differently?" The guy blinked. That wasn't the response he was expecting. "You want me gone?" JD continued. "Fine, but you got the floor. Say what you need to say." The diner was dead silent now. Even the kitchen had gone still, no plates clinking, no orders being called out. Rick sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "This ain't what I expected tonight." JD cracked a small, tired smile. "Me neither." But for the first time, the tension wasn't just about division. It was about something else, something closer to understanding. The younger guy in the booth sat up now, his arms no longer crossed. He looked at JD, really looked at him, like he was trying to decide if this was still some game or if it had turned into something else. Rick, still leaning on the chair across from JD, rubbed a hand over his jaw, exhaling through his nose. The weight in the room wasn't the same as before. The tension was still there, but it had changed. It wasn't about confrontation anymore. It was about something harder to pin down. Rick shook his head. "You want to know what people think?" He let out a short breath, glancing toward the counter before looking back at JD. "They think you're full of it." JD didn't react, didn't flinch. He just tilted his head slightly like he was considering the words carefully. Rick leaned forward, voice lower now. "They think you talk about working-class folks, but you still play the game. That you make promises like every other guy in a suit. But when it comes down to it," Rick exhaled sharply, "nothing changes." The words landed heavy. Across the room, the old man at the counter took a sip of coffee, not looking up, but not missing a word either. JD nodded slowly. "I get that." The younger guy in the booth scoffed. "That's it?" His voice had a sharp edge. "That's all you're gonna say?" JD turned to him. "What else do you want me to say?" The guy straightened in his seat. "I don't know, man. You're supposed to argue, defend yourself. Say something." JD rested his forearms on the table. "You already made up your mind about me before I walked through that door." He kept his voice calm, controlled. "You wanted me to get mad, wanted me to fight back so you could feel justified." The guy's mouth opened slightly, but nothing came out. JD continued, steady. But what if I told you I know exactly what that frustration feels like? He turned back to Rick. You said nothing changes. I know that feeling. I grew up in it. I watched people around me get left behind. Hell, I felt left behind. And yeah, I went to school, did things people never expected me to do. But that doesn't mean I forgot. Rick's fingers tapped against the back of the chair. His expression was unreadable, but he wasn't dismissive. He looked thoughtful. JD glanced around the diner. You don't have to agree with me. I'm not here to change your minds. But I walked in here as a customer, not a politician, just a guy looking for a meal. A pause. Then from the counter, the old man in the work jacket muttered, Damn shame when a man can't even get a burger. The tension cracked just slightly. A few people smirked. Even Rick let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. JD turned back to him. So what now? Rick exhaled, running a hand over his face. He looked toward the kitchen where the cooks were still watching, then back at JD. I'll tell you what, Rick finally said. You sit here and finish this conversation, and if by the end of it, I don't think you're just another guy talking a good game. He shrugged. Maybe, just maybe. I'll have my waitress bring you a menu. JD smirked slightly, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. Sounds like a deal. For the first time that night, the room didn't feel divided. It felt like something else, something closer to a conversation. Rick was still standing, arms crossed, but the tension in his shoulders had eased. The younger guy in the booth, the one who had been the loudest, wasn't leaning back anymore. He was sitting up, elbows on the table, watching JD with something closer to curiosity than hostility. The old man at the counter lifted his coffee, took a slow sip, then muttered, Well, he's still sitting here. Either give the man a menu or throw him out. But I'm trying to eat. A couple of chuckles rippled through the room. The tightness in the air, the weight of unspoken words. It had shifted. The moment had stretched as far as it could go, and now it was at a breaking point. Rick rubbed his hands together, exhaled, then turned to the counter. Mary, he called. Get him a menu. The diner went still for half a second. The younger guy in the booth let out a scoff, shaking his head, but he didn't argue. The waitress, Mary, hesitated for only a moment before reaching under the counter and grabbing a laminated menu. She walked it over to JD, setting it down in front of him. JD picked it up, flipping it open like he had all the time in the world. Appreciate it. Rick shook his head, half amused, half in disbelief. I still don't know if I like you. JD smirked, glancing at him over the menu. That's all right. I don't need everyone to like me. Rick let out a short chuckle, then turned toward the kitchen. All right, boys, fire up the grill. And just like that, what started as a flat-out refusal turned into something no one in that diner would forget. The tension faded, not completely, but enough. Enough for forks to clink against plates again, for conversations to pick up, for the air to feel just a little lighter. JD sat at the booth, menu in hand, but he wasn't reading it. He was watching. Watching Rick, watching the old man at the counter, watching the younger guy in the booth who still looked skeptical, but wasn't smirking anymore. Mary, the waitress, came back a moment later, pouring him a cup of coffee without a word. JD nodded in thanks. She hesitated for half a second, then muttered, We make it strong here. JD took a sip and raised an eyebrow. I can tell. A couple of chuckles. It wasn't much, but it was something. Rick was still standing by the kitchen, arms crossed, watching JD like he was trying to figure out what to make of him. Finally, he sighed and walked back over, dropping into the seat across from him. All right, he said, resting his arms on the table. Since you're here, tell me something. JD set the menu down. What's that? Rick tilted his head slightly. You ever had this happen before? JD thought about that. Not just the rejection, because rejection was part of the job. People loved you one minute, hated you the next. But this? Being told he wasn't welcome in a place as simple as a roadside diner? Not in this way. Not with this kind of weight behind it. No, JD admitted. Not like this. Rick nodded slowly, as if that confirmed something he'd been wondering. And you stayed. JD leaned back slightly, taking another sip of coffee. Yeah? Rick let out a small chuckle. Most guys in your position would have walked out. Maybe made a fuss. Maybe called a lawyer. Maybe made sure this place was plastered all over the news by morning. JD smirked. Thought about it. Rick laughed at that, shaking his head. Then he sobered. You're not going to change everyone's mind. JD nodded. I know. Rick exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. And I can't promise I won't regret serving you tomorrow morning. JD grinned. That's fair. From the counter, the old man spoke again, not looking up from his coffee. Still a damn shame when a man can't get a burger. JD turned toward him. Well, I think that's about to change. A moment later, Mary appeared with a plate. A classic diner cheeseburger, hand-cut fries on the side. Simple, but perfect. JD picked up the burger, took a bite, silence. Then, with a straight face, he said, "Little dry." For half a second, the diner was dead still. Then, Rick barked out a laugh, the first real one of the night. A few others chuckled. Mary shook her head. JD set the burger down, wiping his hands on a napkin. Kidding. It's good. Rick just shook his head, still smirking. You're a piece of work. JD nodded. I've been told. The younger guy in the booth didn't say anything, but his expression was different now. He wasn't sold, not completely, but he wasn't dismissing JD outright anymore either. As JD finished his meal, the diner started feeling like a diner again. Conversations picked up. Plates clattered. Coffee refills were poured. People still had their opinions, still had their doubts. But for one night in one small town, a different kind of conversation had happened. And maybe that was enough, because in a time when everyone is ready to shout, sometimes the real power is in staying, in listening, and proving, if only for a moment, that not everything has to be a fight. If you made it this far, I've got one question for you. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between walking away and staying to listen? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. And if you found this story worth your time, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. There's always another story to tell, and I'll be here to share it with you. Until next time.